You should welcome everyone again, and you should be seeing on your screen Rodrigo's slides. So I'm going to just briefly introduce our two guest speakers for this hour. You may recall, and some of you may have participated in the pro seminar that Rodrigo and Emilio offered earlier this year in the fall on digital media for community development. And this is a topic that we have been working on and actually expanding in our portfolio in the SID program for a number of years now. We should give credit to one of our friends and colleagues, Professor Francisco Belda, our colleague from Brazil, who really began this work at the Heller School with his students at the State University of Sao Paulo. And Rodrigo and his colleague Emilio have carried on this work. I will briefly introduce them and then just say a very quick word about why we think this is so important. Rodrigo, many of you know. I'm proud to say that he was my student, but also he was my teacher, I think, at the Heller School. He got his degree from Heller in 2016, and since then has gone on to have a fascinating professional life, including now work with the UNDP in El Salvador. And Rodrigo has always been one of those boundary crossers, frontiersmen, working to bring technology and youth and his interests in peace, very important for the Central American region, of course, together. His friend and colleague Emilio, whom Rodrigo has introduced to us, is actually an industrial engineer. He comes from the hard science side of this work. He is based in San Salvador, as is Rodrigo at the moment, and he works in a variety of roles in nonprofits. One thing that stands out from his CV that I think is quite interesting is that he worked for a number of years as an international volunteer officer for Habitat for Humanity in El Salvador. So Emilio also is a frontiersman in the sense of a boundary crosser. And the reason that this work is so important is, technology is omnipresent. Here we are in it, literally. Where would we be if we did not have technology during these times of the pandemic? But more and more technological tools are accessible for humanity in general, for good and for not so good. But we can also see that, particularly as applied to the field of development, there is an enormous and ever increasing interface between technological and technology-based strategies and the kind of human-centered, rights-based development that we are interested in. And so being aware of what this digital revolution means, it's an ongoing revolution, what it means for our field, and which are the tools that are most relevant for us in our careers. There's such a broad array. I think that the idea here is that to share with a broader Heller community beyond those who could take the pro seminar exactly what this interface looks like. And I think that you have before you here two practitioners and people very familiar who are engaged in worldwide global networks of people that are engaging in this digital space in order to promote the kinds of equitable and sustainable development that we're interested in. So it's a real privilege to welcome you both. And Rodrigo, with that, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dazen. Thank you, Victoria, for helping us arrange this session. And thank you for being here today. It's so good to see familiar faces, new faces, I feel like I'm back at Heller, which is always a good thing. We'll try to be quick because we do want to make this session as engaging as possible. It's important for us to remember how it all started. And Professor Dassen talked about this a little bit. This is 2014. This is a picture taken from the first pro seminar that Professor Francisco Belda facilitated that year. That's me in 2014 with less facial hair and a lot less experience, and it was just such a fascinating pro seminar that really ignited something in me and led me to work in the intersection of technology, innovation, and development. And this is how it's going. We had a pro seminar, as Professor Dassen mentioned, last fall, with great participation from amazing SID students, some COEX students as well. So it was a great and fabulous experience that we shared last year. We're gonna do a lightning recap of what that seminar was all about, because it's important for us to share some of the core concepts of the technology for development practice, and what is the key message that we wanted to leave students at the pro seminar with. So just reviewing very quickly some of the concepts that we went over. We wanted to shift the paradigm from this concepts of solutionism, which, it's tool-based interventions which seek to solve the wicked problems by applying tools. This can all be summed into the app solutionism, I guess, paradigm, which is this conception that everything can be solved through an app or a platform or blockchain. We need to move from that paradigm to the one of appropriateness, which is a more contextual approach to development and designing interventions that are considering the systemic issues of inequality, injustice, and before start thinking about the solution. Another paradigm shift that we wanted to move away from is gigantism as a mindset that drives all economic growth towards scaling. We hear this a lot in the development world. Scale is everything. If it's not scalable, it doesn't work. If it's not disruptive, it doesn't work. And we wanted to move away from that. It's not that scale is not important, but sustainability is more important. Finding out what's the right scale for each intervention is what's going to drive the future of development as we know it, now that we are facing even greater challenges and with less resources, because COVID has impacted so many aspects of our lives, and we realize that local is coming back in a big way, and we need to balance the social aspects of our interventions and the planetary sides of our intervention. Moving forward with centralization towards distribution, we needed to convey this idea of that concentration of decision making and resources is detrimental to the future of development, and this should be distributed. Methods that involve equal access to knowledge and resources are key for us to have a more sustainable practice. And this can be exemplified through our usual practices of extracting information and data from communities versus giving it back. We don't usually give back the information we go and collect in person or through digital means. This is not redistributed as it should be in many occasions. So through this lightning recap, we wanted to land on the premise that technology is a tool for sustainable development, not an end goal. And this is, seems very straightforward, common sense, if you will, but it's not always that, and we need to remind ourselves that the solution is not always what we should strive for, but digging deeper into the root causes of the problems, the wicked problems we're trying to tackle. And Emilio is gonna dive into the broader scheme of the intersection of this factors of the natural, technological, and social.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, first of all, and nice to see you here. I think that when we consider technology, it's sometimes it can get very one-sided. And the reason for that is that there are other different types of incentives to create and to scale technology that differ philosophically from the end goal of international development. So how can we make good use of technology in our work for bettering societies? One way to see it is by looking at the individuals or communities as part of a system that intersects with the natural world, which is the environment, the social, which is other people, other communities, and then technology, which sometimes can be seen as an extension of the abilities of humans. And on the next slide, you will see a different set of different elements that comprise each of these systems. And when we think of technology, this is only one side of the equation with different tools, infrastructure, systems, means of productions. All of these are created by humans to improve either speed or ability to organize content or to communicate. And whatever change is done to this system will affect others. One application of that we discussed with Rodrigo a lot during this brainstorming for this presentation is this the tetrad of McLuhan. Because McLuhan, what he did is think of what new technologies would bring that would better society, but then what would be detrimental as well, or what would be put aside as obsolete, or what would be retrieved. So the international development worker needs to have a systemic view of how the person is being affected by all of these systems, and how can technology be used, whether is it relevant for a specific context or not. Can you put the next one? Yes. So when we think of international development, the first thing that has to come to mind is the people and how we liberate them, how we create a better environment for them to take decisions, for empowerment, for organization. And that will not change. Technology is not coming to change any of that, and rather should be used as means to enhance the ability for people to communicate, to empower themselves, to take decisions, to organize. In the past few years, with the advent of new technologies, we have seen how new opportunities for using technology will give us tremendous amount of promises of how the world will be changed, and how a simple piece of tech or the application of certain technique will completely change the way that we do things. And sometimes it can, to a cost. So with this, we're not saying that we're against technology, but rather we are promoting how international development can work closely with technology in ways that really connect with the needs of communities, with the motivations of technology developers, and all of this happens in different mindsets and in different cycles of product development, of project management. So that alone brings new needs for competencies that we need to have. And for that, we tried to think of how the cycle of innovation works. When you think of how a project comes from start to finish, coming to the market and being put to the service of a market to be sold, interchanged, there are different life cycles, and there are different timelines that are seen. Can you put that one? So you will see here that there's always a disconnect with the necessities of communities and these motivations. How can we make both of them work? And for that, I'm going to give you one personal example that happened to a personal project. This is a card game that we used in San Salvador to map violence prevalence in downtown, in the center. So this is a somewhat dangerous community that we're working in, and we developed a game based very closely to Cards Against Humanity, where people would vote. So is it difficult to cross the traffic or to go out at night without being mugged in the intersections of such and such, and people would vote, and then we would put in real time these points in the map and give the data back to them, and they would validate our findings. But coming to this, in order to come to this, we have to go through a process that looks like levels of complexity that we had to get rid of. So the second slide is 1 year before, we were doing a workshop on which we were developing open hardware sensors in order to validate the needs of our community and to help them communicate in case of natural disasters. And that had a small component of community mapping. So, and if you go a year before that, we will see that we were on the testing of a open hardware initiative for people to communicate. And then the final one is the proposal that we had on which we won the grant to start this technological initiative. When you think of what we did on the first slide, which is the most recent, it's way more simple than what we had proposed. And that comes to this mindset of solutionism that we had as a group 5 years ago, on which we had this idea: how about if we develop a hardware for people to communicate, and then we can save lives? And then we put it into the community, we tell them this is going to work, let's validate it, etc. And in the process, we started stripping the project of all these very expensive cost of technology, and came down to a very simple card game that only put data on a script and then would project on a wall. So these processes will continue to happen. And the reason is because there's always this disconnect. There's always the ideas that we put together with the needs of the community. And there's this process that's very iterative. That differs a little bit from what we would see on different projects, where technologies that are appropriate are very simple to implement. People understand them. We've seen them used in different places around the world, and we know that they're going to work. But in this case, we have to work with other people who are outsiders, who are developing technology, who have their own interests, and we have to validate whether these solutions work. We have to think about how we can strip from different costs of development. We have to prototype a lot more. We have to be faster. And we have to share these decisions with communities in order to learn from them and for them to say, yes, we want this, or no, we don't want this, or to observe in order to know what will happen if we continue down the line. And that comes to the point that technology is never neutral. And there's always power being exerted when we bring technology. So we have to ask ourselves, who are the stakeholders who are really interested in implementing this technology, who's really winning power? Is it the communities? And power can be exerted through the means of production in order to generate certain technology, or to implement it, or to maintain it, or to learn how to use it. So all of these carry different stakeholders that we have to learn to manage. And for that, we have the cycle of innovation. Knowing how to innovate correctly while bringing the needs of the community is one of the most important skills that bring others into concoction, so that we can work together in order to develop good solutions and be able to tell what's good from what's bad. So the usual innovation process has 4 different items. First is having an insight, understanding what's wrong and coming up with an idea, then developing a problem definition, testing a solution, and finally creating a business model. And down on the lower side of the image, you can see that there are different mindsets and paradigms for design. And some of them are close to how we generate these ideas, how we go out and look at how people do their daily lives, what are the problems that they have, how do we bring together from different perspectives, and how we can come up with ideas of how technology can be used to solve these problems. And this here is the usual process of innovation that can come for us to help us solve a problem. And some of them come at the end, just taking a solution and scaling it up. But now we have repurposed this in order to think of how international development can make use of this, and what are the skills needed to develop good solutions that are appropriate. So I leave it to you, Rodrigo.
And I'm gonna make a quick pause at this moment, because I want to go back a little bit to Emilio's story, which we picked very intentionally because it serves multiple purposes. But the first one is that I asked Emilio to share this story backwards, because we were going to share the story in a linear way, chronologically, but then we realized that it was an interesting exercise to see how the solution was so simple. Like the things that the community needed were a lot more simple than having a technology device that was based on the Internet of Things and that had a bunch of sensors and really cool stuff, and just changing the narrative backwards, and realizing how they had to strip the original high-tech model from its unnecessary elements, and getting down to a simple solution that served the community probably better, or the same. It doesn't have to be better or worse, but the same than the actual technology device. And this is important for several reasons, but I wanted for you to think about the different roles in that story. You had Emilio and his team as and within his team, there was an idea. There was someone that designed this idea and thought, wouldn't it be cool if we did this with this technology? There were other members of the team that went into this, set the problem, defined the intervention, moved on to implementing the solution, and there wasn't even a business model that was created afterwards. So think about those different roles. Think about the different roles that we serve as development practitioners in our organizations at the moment, when we go and see the next slide, because you'll see how they apply in this scenario. So in repurposing this innovation cycle, one of the conversations that we were having prior to this session with Professor Dassin in the waiting room was how the conversation originated from the pro seminar, where we discussed the core skills that the development practitioner should have, but from a more philosophical standpoint, from a more soft skill perspective. And as we were working with a Heller crowd, right, that is very, very aligned with liberation as a way to see development, with social justice. We wanted to start there, but as the conversation progressed, we started thinking about, okay, so if the Heller students already have a good set of soft skills that they can build on hard skills, what are those, right? And we started thinking about that, and went into the tech world, went into the innovation world, and saw the intersection of these two worlds, and came up with this realization that development is already picking up on some of these trends, but we need to develop them more intentionally if we want to serve communities in alignment with our ethical values as well. So going back to the graph, we have this inside section, which is a lot more on the research side. It's going into communities and conducting ethnographic research, networking, connecting with the different stakeholders in the community in a very basic way, just trying to understand what are the key insights. This reflects on the tech world as, your probably salesperson that goes into the different communities, but not the communities in the sense that we know them, and does a little bit of research, right? But transitioning to the problem, we saw some of the core skills that development practitioners have around project design, participatory methods, stakeholder management. These are some of the things that we have identified. There's this intersection, right? So, and these are the skills that we need to develop as we incorporate more of the technology solutions into our practice. And talking about solutions, we are seeing new skills that probably were not in our wheelhouse before. We're talking about the architecture and engineering of solutions. This doesn't mean architecture in the sense of profession in architecture, but designing the principles and the structure of a solution, of a technology-based solution. And the engineering part is, how does that work in real life? And there's additional skills around community validation, testing, which complement the skills that we learn at Heller, right? Like P&I, monitoring, evaluation, all of this combined in this new comprehensive development practitioner that draws from the tech world, from the innovation world, the soft skills of agile design, of design thinking and other methodologies, and combines it with specific skills that are in the harder side of things. And lastly, we have a business model. So you will need to develop business development skills, impact communications, exploring new markets. And I want to walk you through different roles of development practitioners along this chain, which you can start imagining in the future where you'd like to be. Are you more of a researcher? Are you going to be the person going into communities and being able to identify the key issues that the community is facing, bringing that back to the folks that are going to design an intervention. And with that, if you're interested in the intersection of technology and development, you need to have those skills to identify digital contexts, observe what is the digital and connectivity situation of this community in particular, and being able to communicate that with the teams that are going to develop the solutions. Or are you going to be that team that gets that initial input and designs a technology-based solution where you're going to need the skills of knowing where to tap into in terms of service providers, technical teams. You're going to need to know who is selling you a good product, whether it's off the shelf, open source or proprietary. You need to have that set of skills to identify what's right, what's appropriate, how to validate these solutions with the public, with the communities, and bring that back, iterate, test, and then implement. Once you implement that solution, you will transition that to the business development team, probably at your organization. And maybe you are part of that team where you will need to take that implementation, extract the learnings from that implementation, turn that into whether it is a new proposal for a new funder to scale with the same funder that invested in the first solution, or you will explore the market and see how that can be adapted into a new business model. So, this is the intersection of these two worlds that we wanted to present to you, so that you can start imagining the roles that you currently have or that you have held previously in your organizations, and think about some of the future roles that you will have. In the cycle, again, you'll have the problem definition stage, where you will be co-designing these development projects, acting like a liaison between the needs of a community, their expectations, and the limitations of technology. And this translates into skills in the participatory thinking, UX, user experience design, and solutions mapping. This I introduced from UNDP's Accelerator Lab practice. In the solution design and implementation, you'll be working with different people from different technical areas as well. So you'll need to navigate between disciplines and carrying that information back and forth. So you need skills in information architecture, validation and testing, in-house tech management. Some teams will be fortunate enough to have in-house tech teams, but if not, you'll be able to coordinate with a vendor or a service provider management and know exactly what you need and how to communicate that with them, so that when they deliver the actual product, you know whether it is a good one or not. And lastly, again, with the business model and scaling, you will be able to develop a strong case for raising additional funds and scaling the use of these technologies through actionable evidence. So you'll need skills on digital and impact communications, predictive analysis. You'll be able to gather data to construct your evidence-based approaches. And you will also develop skills to create capacities within the communities to make your initiative sustainable. And one thing that's very important is future thinking. We usually are strained by the theory of change, which only thinks about one potential future. Whether you do this, you will get this. But future thinking allows you to think about the multiple ways in which your intervention can end up. And it's a new skill that development practitioners should embrace. And it can be tech-enabled or just using traditional future thinking methodologies. And lastly, we just wanted to leave you with some food for thought about some of the the development jobs of the present, right? Now they're not even in the future, but they might look like that for us at some times. But roles as data for development analysts are going to be super important in the next few years. They already are. This will mean everything from what you learn with Professor Ravi on the GIS class, but taking that and analyzing the data in a large or a small scale will be relevant for justifying an intervention in one place versus the other. Um, Having roles as technology for development liaisons is going to be very important. This is good news for everyone that is not a technologist like myself, and I speak from experience when I say that this is a role that many of you will be positioned to carry out very successfully, because it only requires you to know or be really interested in technology on, a small percentage, but then be very well versed in the needs of a community and the more theoretical approaches that you are familiar with, and bringing that information back and forth. Technical teams is going to be very crucial for the future of development. Innovation leads, technology is usually equated with innovation, but it's not always the same. So people that are able to apply innovation frameworks to the design of development interventions, user-centered design, user experience models, gamification will be crucial as well. For that, there will be specific roles in the UX and design lead space. So I think with that, we wanted to open the conversation for you to share some of your impressions around what the present and the future of development jobs is going to look like, and if these are skills that are at your disposal right now, or that you would like to develop in through a program like the SID program. And I don't know if you want to add anything else before we open to questions, Emilio.
Yeah, very quickly. I think three things come to my mind, just to close very briefly. First one is that the concept of rural, what is rural, changed over the past 60 years. Came from rural is poverty to now a more diversity, a view with more diversity. Rurality is a view where there are so many different ways of life, many different ways of production, of lifestyles, etc. And I see technology having to deal with not only one narrative that's being imposed by capitalism, for example, that says your life should be better and technology is going to help you be this. But rather, we are going to have to create a narrative on which technology in the future will help us achieve what people want. So that is one. The second one is the idea of degrowth, because there is this whole paradigm that's coming that is saying it's not all about being big. And Rodrigo mentioned about gigantism at the beginning. So how can we scale back while still making people feel satisfied with their lifestyle? And that is going to be an important part of international development and technology. How can technology be able to make people happy and also solve their problems? And then finally, that these processes of innovation sometimes are ruthless, and when they're done in a laboratory, that is one thing, but when they're being tested in the real world, there is the danger of harm. So an important part of international development and technology is going to create safe spaces for communities to innovate while still creating a space of privacy, of security in many different ways that technology can bring. So how can we alleviate or prevent some of the damages that technology may bring?
Thanks, Emilio. And definitely, this is a way larger conversation. We just touched the tip of the iceberg on what the future of the development sector is going to look like in a post-COVID era, in a climate change era where degrowth is going to be very important, like realizing what local can mean for sustainable development. We're gonna question a lot of the paradigms that we have been using for many years. So I hope you have enjoyed this glimpse of the skills that you should start looking for in order to insert yourself in an organization that is currently evolving. Also, it's important to mention that not only will you be able to work for an international development organization or a nonprofit or an implementer, but in the private sector, in the government, all of the skills are also relevant. And as companies also move to a models where sustainability is increasingly important, this sets of skills will also position you in favor and even in advantage of other profiles. So I'll leave you with that, and we can have a quick conversation on this topic.
Professor Dassin, did you want to start with some Q&A? You're muted.
Okay, thank you so much. Rodrigo, do you want to quit the slideshow so we can see the speakers? There you go. Great. All right. Well, this was a lot of food for thought. And, I would just, I'm sure the students have lots of questions. I would just start with a reflection based on the presentation. Thank you so much. And it makes me feel as if SID, which was conceived as a kind of cutting edge program maybe 30 years ago, we really do need to retool in terms of preparing students for the 21st century. And, when I begin to think kind of practically about how we would get there from where we are now, it, in my mind, raises a larger issue, which is that universities in general, even progressive ones like Brandeis, are still organized around disciplines and 19th century academic culture. So the idea of bringing together the latest developments in the innovation space, in the engineering space, in the development world, in the world of economic analysis, right? So much of what you're saying depends on the evolution of global capitalism, for example. Figuring out how that would be done in a university. Certainly there are, innovation centers. Some of our alumni actually work at them, which are often in engineering schools. So there's a long way from how even a progressive interdisciplinary academic space like the Heller School is organized to the kind of intersectionality and the kind of cross-fertilization that we really need to be thinking about these skills. So it's a huge challenge, but I thank you for laying a marker for us and others. This is fascinating work. And the question is, how could we as educational providers be thinking about how to get ahead of some of these curves and occupy different spaces than the ones we currently occupy. So with that, I'm sure a number of you have questions or comments, please. And you can just address them directly to the speakers.
Okay, I have a question. I'm not sure I'm going to phrase it very well, but I'll try. I feel like when we talk about development and climate change, there's a lot of limitations that have to happen, scaling back as the speaker said. But I think there still is the idea of sort of development, or the ideal sort of goal of development, as this kind of capitalist never-ending growth. So how can we work toward the scaling back if that narrative still exists, if that's still the sort of ideal of what progress and development and growth look like?
I think I can start. There are a few ways to address the problem of what technology or what human activity is creating. And some of those responses have to do with, it's the cost of progress, for example. Another one could be, let's just get rid of it and become, what's the word in English, Luddites? I always forget.
Luddites, yeah.
Luddites, yeah. So, like, no technology at all, and let's just get rid of it. And then others have to be in the center, as in, let's create other technology to solve this pollution problem, for example. And that happens also in the international development. So in other areas. But I see in climate change, for example, such and such university created a robot to solve the problem of plastic in the oceans. And we see more technology to solve the problems of technology. And then there are others of, let's just how about if we just reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide, etc. So we have to be sure of what is the narrative that we are putting in place, and we think of the real causes. We speak to people about what you're doing is not going to solve the problem, for example, or is going to solve it at a short term. So I think it's important, and that is why I think that the main role of international development workers in these problems is to set a narrative and to tell it from the perspective that is very human-centered in social justice. And we have to be a voice that understands technology and understands the value of it, but also understands what it is creating. And even in the sense of not only of what is going to be created in terms of jobs and economic growth in 10 years, but rather in 50 or 100 years. So knowing technology well is a good starting point, and taking up those spaces is important. And just as a last thing, I was just on a call where we were discussing the stack of climate change technologies. As in, I think they were talking about acquisition, governance, sharing, evaluation. So all of these different activities are broken down and evaluated in terms of what is the cost for the environment. And the discussion was about how about open data and open source technologies, etc. Do they really create lesser burden on the environment? So, there's space not only for technologists there, but also for people who have direct communications with communities, and to have these discussions where not only people from the global north are given, their thoughts because they traveled to Africa once or twice, or, and they came back. And I understand what's the problem, but rather how do we bring different people together to bring voices?
I'll just add something to that question, because it's really relevant and funny that you mentioned it. One of the resources that we looked at in order to determine some of the jobs of the future of development was, and we didn't include it in here, but now that you mention it, it seems like a mistake not including it. It's climate change and environmental experts that have specific experience in technology. So organizations need people that can tell them which technology interventions are suitable for tackling the development challenges that they're facing, but also being able to tell them with data and with evidence why sometimes technology is going to have a negative impact on the work that they are carrying out. So it's really important for organizations to have this type of professional that is able to understand technology and assess with data and with evidence the impact that this technology can have, whether it's negative or positive. And one thing I'll mention also is that this trend is already starting to come to, you know, to the biggest spheres, and talking about UNDP specifically. The Accelerator Lab initiative is actually intended to do just that, reverse the way in which we look at development, and not create new things, but start by exploring what's already out there, what are communities doing already in order to mitigate climate change effects, or tackle everyday community problems. So it's good to see that these trends are already making it to the big leagues, and hopefully they'll also come down as a mainstream practice in the future. I see that there's more questions.
Hello.
So I'll move on to yes, perfect.
Hi,
Pervez.
this is Pervez speaking. So I work with the development sector now. I'm a SID student as well for the last 16 years. I worked with these disruptive technologies. I think there are two main areas if we segregate this. One, the technology we use to being a practitioner to design, study, or have a better poverty targeting mechanisms. At that point, I think technology really supplement us. It doesn't affect the community. And for example, just in my last project, we are supposed to take 1 million household poverty scorecard. It is supposed to cost us millions, but we used technology, and that cost us 10% than the manual one. So that these kind of things, we should segregate these things. The second is taking solution for problems like climate change, and doing through technology needs some kind of exceptional effort, because the technology is disruptive. So I think, like for example, credit programs, they want the digital payment system will be good. Okay, fine, we did it, but at the end we learned that the communities are 84% are illiterate, so they don't use mobiles. So taking solution to the communities through technologies are really disruptive. That everybody knows. But for the development perspective, like being a development professional, for us using technology as a means to reconfirm our strategies, to reconfirm our approaches, I think it is one of the best things we have to work on it. And it has to be scaled up. It has to be scaled up if you are going to address 1 million below poverty line populations. The normal conventional way may not help you. So this is my thoughts. And I think you guys have put something very innovatively, like addressing real problems through technologies really have consequences. We should be very careful in.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just, oh yes, Professor Das.
Rodrigo, there are two questions in the chat, so that Methi proposed, so maybe you want to take a look at that.
Perfect. Yes, before I move on to those two questions, I just wanted to react real quick to Pervez's comment, because something that's also useful in this setting is to, or another trend I'd say for the future of development is moving from pilots, from long pilots that take 2-3 years, to experimentation, to doing faster iterations based on the fact that the problems we're facing are changing more rapidly, and circumstances vary so differently than we thought about before. So experimenting in quick cycles can also help us steer in the right direction, more agile, in a more agile way than before. Addressing the two questions, how can development practitioners balance the global trends of utilizing tech with the forms of native tech preferred by host country nationals in the country where a project is being implemented? And what sorts of roles in the development utilize tech but are better suited for big picture thinkers? Oftentimes, roles require highly analytical number crunching skills that don't match my interests and skills. I think that Emilio should take the first one, and I'll take the second one.
I
Does
was
that
going
make
to say
sense?
the same. Yes. Yeah. For the first one, oh man, this is a complicated one to answer, but I would say it's. I think technology is, it doesn't have, like, it's agnostic in the sense of it doesn't belong to anybody to a degree, like knowledge. It's like saying I play chess. Chess was invented in India, but there's a point on which the whole world is being globalized, and technology is, to a degree, just um, yeah, just an asset. Having said that, there's a difference between that, where, for example, an idea was created in one country, but it is replicated in another, compared to the power that intellectual property brings into international development. For example, and some other downsides of technology. For example, databases, how we manage a database of members of a community who are going to do something, for example. How can we make sure that we are not harming people in a specific area by sending personal information abroad to a different server residing somewhere else? That is one. And there's been cases where social innovation startups have had security breaches, and databases with even government IDs have been just stolen and put in the public and sold. So we have to be careful of that. Then for locally implemented technologies, the big problem, and that's the downside of localizing it, is having the right skills. And for that, I think implementing technology, despite what it would seem, is a long-term job. Generating the skills, creating the infrastructure, having the tools to generate it. I see it. So my work comprises is working on sharing knowledge for reproducing appropriate technology. I work for Appropedia Foundation, which is a large compendium of international development and sustainability technologies. And we see that, like, part of our work and part of the goal that we want to achieve is to give local communities the abilities to reproduce. But having that capability brings long work alongside only the knowledge. So yeah, I think that is why having everything together is important for technology. So I don't know if that was a good answer. I hope it was. So I leave Rodrigo with the second one.
I'll just make a quick commercial for Appropedia as well. It's the largest wiki on sustainability, and hopefully it'll be useful for many of your projects at the program. Actually, there's this massive repository of appropriate technologies that have been documented by development practitioners such as yourselves, engineers, academics, that are just out there and can be replicated, adapted to local context. And this is the way in which we contribute to appropriate technology adoption, to reverse those trends that Methy mentions in her question. So the second question I'll answer from a personal light. I am that. I want to think of myself as that big picture thinker. I'm not a technologist. I am not good with numbers. I actually dropped out of Professor Godoy's class because it was too hard. But I do have other types of skills, and those are in connecting development needs with development teams. And this is a role that is increasingly important. We did mention it earlier. It's having technology for development liaisons, right? Having folks that can understand what a community needs, or what a technical team on education or on governance or violence prevention wants to do, translating that into technical requirements for a technology team of developers, of designers, of engineers, so that vision transforms into reality. And being able to navigate back and forth those two is a key skill, and it requires a lot of imagination, a lot of empathy, a lot of good communication skills, which is something that I see are probably your skills as well, Methi. So this is one very specific personal example on how I see, and we've talked about this with Professor Dassin, that SID students and professionals have already, like you already have that coming in the program. You further develop these skills as you progress through the program. And it's important for you to know, because sometimes you will feel scared or intimidated by this industry where more people are, data scientists and programmers, but don't, because you have this specific set of skills that is often needed. There's a bridge that needs to be gap, like that. There's a gap that needs to be bridged between these two sides.
Yeah, and I may just add very quickly that technology requires lots of community builders, and that is so important, especially for the open source community, and is a skill that I've seen many people who don't know how to make a line of code make it really great by helping other people contribute, telling them how to work together, and putting them closer to communities who are in need. Being a liaison of, hey, I am a startup. Do you want to go and test? And do you want to, for example, facilitate a workshop with a community, asking them what they think, being, like socially aware of what is the real needs of people. And there's a very social component to technology, because appropriate technology is not only defined by what works best, but what people have the feeling that works best for them and makes them happy. And there's always this desire to be modern, the desire to be part of a trend. And we have to put that into account, that part of the reason why technology is so big in international development is because people have this mindset that technology is going to make them happier. So there's lots of important social skills that have to be put into our work.
Right. Could I just jump in there for a second? I think that is so important. Thank you for making that argument. And I guess I would sum it up by saying that technology is too important to be left solely to the technologists, just as because it's so critical to keep at the root of our vision, the lens through which we see this, our values of equity, inclusion, our value of environmental justice, all of those ultimately really kind of social and political ideas. And at the root of that, if we were to delve even farther, I was making this argument just today to Professor Godoy, my dear friend, that after all, SID, if we just look at that in particular, it's an MA program. It's a Master of Arts in a liberal arts university. And at the root of that is a humanistic, let's hope it's a kind of radical humanistic view of human-centered development. And understanding, we can't turn our backs on these trends. I agree with you totally, Emilio. It might be fashionable to be a Luddite, but I don't think it's practical in the sense that technology will intrude. We can't turn our backs on all of these trends. On the contrary, we have to be as engaged as possible but also never lose our capacity for critical analysis. At the end of the day, that's what is the core of humanistic liberal arts education, is critical thinking. And so that's a skill that we hope that all of the courses in the SID program and at Heller address, sharpen that in some way, in addition to this kind of systems thinking that comes out of engineering, but really should be applied to the way we think about knowledge, not only knowledge consumption, but knowledge creation. Because I think at the end of the day, the only way to stay ahead of the innovation curve is to be a good knowledge generator. And that means not necessarily staying in an ivory tower, so you can do that, but engaging with communities around the world. And I would just, I can't resist, underscore one other really key point that Emilio made, that SID, I'm very proud of the diversity of people that we have here, because the development debates, and certainly the large multilateral institutions, I mean, the World Bank being the epigrammatic case of this, have been dominated by Western Northern voices for decades. So while there have been thinkers for decades who have written essays on the concept of degrowth, for example, and post-development and alternatives, they're critical people out there, but they've never been in the mainstream, right? And so the organizations that set the tone, and more importantly, control the flow of aid dollars, those have been very reactionary in the sense, generally, in the sense of preserving the status quo. But that consensus has broken up, it seems to me. And so the argument that Emilio and Rodrigo are making is that there are spaces, critical spaces, that can be occupied with people, by people with a whole range of skills. But to be effective at the small level, you need to understand the big picture, and vice versa.
This is going on a shirt. Technology is too important to leave it only in the hands of technologists.
Sure. I love
so
it.
Good.
Right, perfect. Other questions? We have a few more minutes.
I think that Mohammed had a question in the chat box about fraud.
Well, I'll see if I can answer that question. Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna talk specifically about frauds, but knowing what's hype and what's actually an appropriate technology is something we addressed extensively in the pro seminar, because it's and that's why it's important for people like you to step into these types of roles, because you need these filters between startups or people that are gonna want to sell an organization really hyped up tool or a blockchain solution, to identify what are some of the key aspects of the technology itself, but also the need that it's supposed to be solving. So by having people with this combination of skills, you'll be able to filter out the appropriate technologies, because it could be a very disruptive tool, can be blockchain based, and it can actually serve the purpose that the organization seeks. But if you don't have a combination of the basic knowledge on how that technology works, I'm no expert in blockchain, but I can tell you if something is, just baloney, or if it's actually a real solution. But also knowing in the more technical side what the organization does and what are the challenges that they're facing. So that's one way to put it. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add to that.
Yeah. The example that I gave at the pro seminar was 3D printing houses. That it doesn't make sense to 3D print houses if the problem, for example, in our setting, at least in El Salvador, is land, like access to land. And as a development worker who knows about technology, you can save a lot of money and resources by not going in the wrong direction, because the technology can also be expensive. And that money goes to someone who is, who wants to develop their solution because they think it's the best. So also knowing how much resources to allot to each solution, and knowing when is the best moment, the right time when all the conditions are met that are not technological conditions. So that is an important asset. You become an important asset for international development if you know when to do it, how to do it, and how to work with people who are interested in making business, right? So that's important. Just thinking of, do we develop locally or do we just buy from a company? Is our email going to be Gmail? Are we going to purchase Zoom for our calls, or are we going to have our own system? So all of these are questions that can become much more and more expensive as technologies, because technologies can be a black hole of resources, and you can spend all of your time developing something that will never be used.
Right. And also, you can't extract the profit motive from virtually all of the platforms that we have. I mean, you, both of you are much more knowledgeable about open source technology and all of that than I am. However, here we are on Zoom, a commercial product. Here we are answering our Gmails. Here we are in the middle of huge, maybe the biggest geopolitical struggle of the day is the US versus China on questions of technology, on questions of 5G, on questions of international property, and so on and so on. So that's where the big picture analysis is really important to understand how to balance those motives. Folks, we're coming up on our time. I know a number of you may have classes at 2 p.m. our time. For Mohammed there in Pakistan, it's getting very late. So thank you for sticking with us during this period. Are there any final questions? Maybe take one more question and then give our speakers a chance to just offer any final thoughts. Okay, I don't hear anything, but I know that, let's put it this way, Rodrigo is a hardcore Hellerite. He's with us forever, no way. And Emilio, also honorary Heller student, and just absolutely wonderful to have such dynamic and innovative people helping us to think through, and I would just, my concluding comment, and I'll turn it over to our speakers. I want to just thank you so much for bringing this whole other universe into view. It's as if our spacecraft got a little bit closer to Mars, like the rover that just landed on Mars, actually Perseverance, because we really need to be able to see not only into the present, but into the future, if we are going to be a responsive and a kind of trendsetter in the development world. And all of you are going to be carrying this forward. And so that's just critical to know what the landscape looks like. So thank you again. And Emilio or Rodrigo, any final words?
Just thanking you. Thank you for opening up this space. It all has evolved in a very organic way and has helped us to learn more about these trends as we develop content for the pro seminar, as we started brainstorming around this session. It's an iterative process and it couldn't work without you. So I'm happy to be a part of this ongoing conversation about the evolution of the SID program, of the development sector in general. So thank you, and I hope you have enjoyed this session, and looking forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that first of all, I would like to thank Rodrigo for dragging me along with him and Professor Dassin for the opportunity always. And I think the best asset that I see for Heller students is that you're learning about values, the values that are important for social justice. And then technology just means to an end. You should not be afraid of it, but rather the technology area needs people like you who can imprint real values and who can tell people what is technology for. Like 100 years ago, C.S. Lewis was saying that technology is seen by some people like magic. Magic is something that people simply use to materialize their dreams. So our goal is to help people find real dreams that are worth living for. And that is what technology should drive us to.
Perfect. Well, once again, thank you. And thanks to all the students and friends of the program who attended. Well, we are unhappy not to be in our beautiful building and kind of resist the limitations imposed by our current moment. At the same time, the technology has enabled us to hear seamlessly from colleagues in a different part of the world. So thank you so much. This was very, very stimulating, and we're sure to return to the topic.